Hey guys, welcome back to another poker vlog. This is the November 2nd, 2024 poker vlog. It's actually the first time we've been down in about 7 sessions, so about a little over a month. But there are a lot of hands that were very educational for me, and there's a lot to take away, so let's get into it. In our first hand, we're on the button with ace queen off. It's four-handed because there's not many people who showed up at the beginning of the session, but later in the night some more people came. Anyway, under the gun raises to 10 bigs, and one thing I should note is that the player who's in the under the gun position is actually playing a little bit more aggressive than I'm used to. Anyway, given our hand, we can play, so we raise to 30 big blinds, and both the small blind and big blind fold. The under the gun calls, and we take our first hand heads up. The flop comes 4, 8, 7, all clubs, which isn't the best flop for us given that we 3-bet pre-flop, but it isn't the terrible spot to be. It isn't the most terrible spot to be in. We have the ace of clubs, so we have removal to the nut flush, and if another club comes, we make the nut flush. The under the gun donks into us for $3, about 30 big blinds, which is half the pot. Later throughout the night, I did realize that he does this a lot, and it's kind of different coming from him than how he usually plays. But there's just so many cards that can improve our hand on the turn, so I call. The turn comes the 7 of hearts pairing the board. This is actually a good card because it decreases the likelihood that he has a 7. Anyway, you can't see it here, but my opponent bets $2, which is about 20 big blinds, which is a down bet from the flop. It's kind of odd, but from how I see it, he's starting to get skittish since I called the flop, and now he's scared that I might have something good. I raised to $7 to try to see his reaction, and we could possibly win the hand right here. Our opponent is thinking for a bit, so I know for sure he didn't flop a flush, which means our hand is probably better than his. Or, at the very best for his case, he might have a pair on the flop. But he goes ahead and puts in the call. The river comes a queen of spades, and our clubs missed. However, one of our overcards hit, so now we have showdown value. Our opponent checks to us, and this kind of tells me that he's kind of scared of our hand. I will say that at this point, it's probably a better idea to check, but because I had a pretty good idea that his hand was absolute garbage or very marginal, and that he only had a bluff catcher, I thought we should raise, and because my stack size was a little over half pot, I decided to go all in. I'm all in. He lets out a sigh, which lets me know that he's not happy about my decision, and he tables his hand. Ace queen off, just like ours, but he has the queen of clubs. After he tables, I'm actually pretty sure that he was gonna fold, and I'd be pretty surprised if he called. If he does call, it's definitely a hero call, as I'm representing a lot of high flushes. After some time to try to level into a decision, he eventually chooses to call. And we chop up the big pot. I'm a little disappointed in how the hand turned out, but I also got some insight into how my opponent plays. I think one thing I would change about how I played this hand is maybe check the river. Because when we go all in on the river, the only thing we're getting calls from is flushes, and maybe trips. In the next hand, we have pocket 5s in the big blind. Under the gun open to 3 bigs, and it folds to me. I call. It's heads up to a flop. The flop comes 10 jack 6 with 2 hearts on the board. I check it over to the under the gun, and he c-bets for half the pot. There are 3 over cards, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that he has one of them, and we have a pair, so we shouldn't be going anywhere anytime soon. I call. The turn comes a deuce of hearts, completing the front door heart. I think checking or betting here is okay, but if we're betting, we probably want to bet small. I choose to check, just to see what my opponent does. After about 10 seconds, he chooses to check back. This gives you some information that he's either slow playing a flush, or doesn't have it. Either way, we shouldn't be too worried for the river. The river comes the 8 of spades. And I could have turned my 5s into a bluff here, because realistically, the only hands I'm beating a showdown are a 2, or ace high, king high, and any other high card, but I just didn't have the guts to do it in this hand, so I checked. My opponent checks back, however, and when I show my hand, I table my 5s, while he tables a pair of 8s on the river. I probably could have gotten in a bluff here, but my opponent isn't dumb, and he knows when he smells bull. And in this case, I think if I just bet on the river out of left field, he probably wouldn't have bought it. I had to have bet the turn and then bet river. One orbit later, we're in the big blind again, but this time with 8s. Hopefully with a little better pocket pair, we'll have a better chance at winning the pot. Under the gun and button fold, and the small blind limps. I raise to 3 bigs, and the small blind calls, so we go heads up. The flop is 7-10-9, giving us an open-ended straight draw. The small blind checks it over to me, and I continue for 3 big blinds again. He calls, so we both see a turn. Lucky for us, the turn's a jack, giving us a straight. I bet again for 3.25 bigs, which is a bit of a small bet, but it's because I don't want to size up too big yet. My goal was actually to have our opponent raise us, since I know that's the kind of player he is. He just calls though, and when the river comes out, it's a king, completing the front door flush. At first, this might be a bad card, but it's not terrible actually, since he'd have to exactly have queen 8 for the straight, or ace queen, but I think our opponent would have bet out and raised first in pre-flop with ace queen, so that's probably not likely. Our opponent checks to us once again, so I know we're probably good. Given his behavior, I'm pretty sure most bets are going to get him to fold. So the only 2 choices I have are to size down really small to make it a very good deal to call, or to size really big and make it seem like a bluff. I chose the latter and he immediately folded. As sad as it is that we couldn't get more value though, I don't think we could have gotten much more out of him. And I'm just happy to win my first pot. Next up, we're on the button with ace 8 suited, one of my favorite hands. Under the gun bets 2.5 bigs, and I raise to 7.5. The small blind folds, but both the big blind and under the gun call, so it's 3 ways to the flop. Flop comes out 10-8-6 of diamonds, but we have the wrong suit, we have hearts. Big blind checks, and so does under the gun. I bet 125, or about 6.25 big blinds. It's about a third of the pot, which is smaller than my usual half pot c-bet, because of how dangerous the board texture is. Especially for me, because I was a 3-better. It's pretty likely for me that I don't have a straight, and I probably don't have a pair either. The big blind folds, but the under the gun calls, so it's heads up to a turn. The turn comes of 4 diamonds, making it 4 to a flush on the board. Remember, I don't have a diamond in my hand. However, the under the gun checks to me, and this indicates to me that he probably doesn't have a diamond either. But because of how dangerous the board is, and because I want to get to a cheap showdown as possible, I check back for pot control. The river comes a 10 of spades, pairing the board. I look to my opponent to see what he does, and he checks again. Our pair of 8s is probably good, and because we don't have a diamond, I don't think it's necessary to bet this river. The pot's good enough for us, so we check back, and our opponent shows nothing. I table my 8, and that's good enough to win the pot. After flopping the nut flush and not getting paid off, we're a little frustrated, so we wait around until we get another playable hand from the big blind. The player to the left of me decided to go up and use the restroom for a bit, so this hand is 3-handed. The button raises to 3 bigs, and the player to the right of me in the small blind folds. I decided to defend with my ace 10 and see a flop. The flop comes 7-6-6 with a pair on the board. This flop is pretty good for my range, and I could easily be holding a 6, a 7, or an open-ender. My opponent c-bets for half after I check it to him. I decided to call since I have 2 overcards, and I can still improve. Not only that, I can try to make a move since this board seems to fit me more than him so far. The turn comes at 10, giving me 2 pair including the pair on the board. I check it to him with plans to check raise if he bets, since I can protect my top now. Betting here is also okay too, and maybe I should have done that instead because he ends up checking back. The river gives me a full house. Now I gotta choose a bet size that'll get me paid off. My opponent hasn't been showing a lot of strength, so now again I have to decide whether to size down to try to get a call out of him for a good price, or I have to size up really big and make it seem like an unreasonable bluff. Because me betting on the river doesn't really make sense, especially if I size big, I think it's okay to go for the big bet here and make it seem like I'm making a really stupid bluff. I pick a size of 12.25 big blinds, which is well over the pot size. Unfortunately, he folds because he got counterfeited on the river. He ended up showing pocket 5s, which meant that even his 5 couldn't play, because there's 2 pair on the board and a 7 for the 5th card. So if he had any better hand, I probably could have gotten a call. In fact, the player to the left of me who was out of the hand even thought I was bluffing. It's unfortunate, but I tabled my full house and pressing the table. Later on, we're in the under the gun position, and we got pocket 8s again. I raise to 3 big blinds, and the button folds, and both the small blind and the big blind call. The flop comes queen 3 ace with 2 spades. The small blind checks, but the big blind dunks into us for $1, about 5 big blinds. I call because I could easily have an ace or a queen here, but I also could have raised here because it would be a great way for me to isolate the big blind who docked. However, the small blind calls too, so it's still the 3 of us to the turn. The turn is a deuce of hearts, which doesn't change anything other than put 3 to the wheel. The small blind checks again, and the big blind leads out for 6.25. He probably has something, likely an ace or a queen, and honestly, I could have folded here. In fact, I probably should have. I wanted to try seeing if I could turn my hand into a bluff on the river, so I called. The small blind calls too, and we all get to see a river. The river comes an ace, carrying the board. The spade draw missed, so we're looking to see the reaction of the other 2 players. The small blind actually checked in the dark, so now it's up to the big blind. He leads out again on the river for 15 big blinds this time, which is a pretty sizable bet. Now we already know since the ace is paired on the board, it's probably less likely that he has an ace, but because of his bet sizing and his behavior, I actually believe him this time. I'm putting him on either an ace or a queen, and for a second I thought about turning my 8s into a bluff here. And because the small blind checked all 3 streets, I probably don't have to worry too much about him having a strong hand. But regardless, I have to get through 2 people in order to bluff, so it's probably not the best spot for me. So I fold and shut down the hand. Regardless, this should really only be a call or fold situation, and raising is usually out of the question. The small blind folds as well, and the big blind ended up showing a queen, saying he was bluffing, when in reality, he had both of us crushed. Coming up next, we pick up King Deuce suited on the button. This is another great hand to play late position because we have the potential to make a big flush. Under the gun bets into 1.25 bigs, and because he's not representing a lot of premiums that have us beat when he raises first in like this, it's not a bad idea to 3-bet here. And because we're in late position, we don't have to 3-bet to a huge size. If we were in early position, we'd probably choose a 4x or 5x raise, but since we're on the button, we can raise to 3x. Given that, I raise to 7.5 bigs. Small blind folds and the big blind calls. The under the gun, who is the initial raiser, gets out of the way for us, so it's heads up to a flop. The flop comes 9-5-6 with a diamond on the board, giving us the backdoor flush. Other than that though, this board isn't really great for us because as a 3-better, most of the time, a high percentage of the time actually, we don't really connect with this board. Whereas the big blind, who's often calling to defend, will most likely have more pairs and draws here. He checks to us though because he wants to see what we do first. Knowing that this flop is better for him than me, I check back. Although we should also keep in mind that we hold most of the over pairs, so betting here actually isn't completely out of the question, but more likely than not, we should be checking a higher frequency here. The turn comes a deuce of spades, so we have bottom pair now, and the big blind checks to us. I don't see how betting will accomplish anything because it's only gonna fold out hands that we beat and get us called by hands that crush us. So checking back is actually the better move. We take it to a river and the 7 of hearts comes out. 4-3 and any 8 will make a straight here now. The big blind leads out for $2, which is 10 bigs on the river. And now we're in an uncomfortable position. He checked the first 2 streets, and all of a sudden he's coming out swinging, and he's betting for about 2/3 of the pot, meaning that he probably either has a really good hand that he's trying to extract maximum value for, or he's just trying to steal the pot. Given our opponent's behavior, I think we can completely eliminate the possibility of him having 4-3. I don't think he'd be defending the big blind with a 3-bet, playing with only 4-3. However, he could easily have an 8 here, and I'm actually thinking ace-8 or pocket 8s could probably be the only hands that he could have that he might be calling pre-flop with and getting here on the river. We only have a bluff catcher, and we block some king 8 combos, which is pretty unfortunate. But after thinking about it for a while, if he checked the flop and turn, that means he probably had something small and likely not a draw. Therefore, I think it's a little less likely that he has a straight. But again, we have bottom pair, so if he had any piece of the board on the flop or turn, he beats us. But since he could also be doing this with a lot of high card, particularly ace high, I decided to call. He shows a 5, which means that we were right about the fact that he didn't have a straight, but unfortunately we were also right that he could probably have a piece of the flop and turn, which is the reason why he checked. It's unfortunate that we got taken to Value Town, but now we have a little bit more information on this guy. Next, we're in under the gun with ace 9 off. I open to 3 big blinds, and both the button and small blind fold. The big blind defends though, and we go heads up. Me, being the clumsy person I am, knocked over my camera for the second time actually. But hopefully this doesn't affect how we play the hand. We smack the flop as it comes ace 4, giving us trips. The big blind checks to us, and I trade for some smaller denomination chips. Once I do, I make a small bet of about 1.5 big blinds. This is because on paired boards like this, we want to find a way to build the pot while still keeping in the opponent's bluffs. And so by continuing for about 25% of the pot, it'll be difficult for big blind to fold. Checking back is also fine in these situations though. But by betting big on the flop, we would reveal the strength of our hand a little too early on. Our opponent actually decides to raise us to 7.5 big blinds. This is a huge raise, but since we have trips, we are in no way folding on this hand. Not on the flop anyways. I make the call, and we see a turn. The turn comes to jack of spades, and I'm fully expecting my opponent to throw another barrel out here on the turn. The big blind checks to us. Now we gotta start betting to protect our hand and charge for value. I choose to bet at 250, which is about 12.5 big blinds, which is a little over half the pot. Our opponent folds and we take it down, and we shouldn't be too upset here because there's very few cards that we'd actually get a call from if he bluff raised the flop. By check raising the flop, we can either put him on an ace or a bluff, and our bet makes sure that we charge the player to peel a river card because there's quite a few cards in the deck that could downgrade our hand or make it scary. For example, any spade can complete any flush draws that the opponent might have, and any king or queen on the river could complete some possible straights. So I'm pretty happy about how I played the hand. A few minutes later, another player comes to sit down at the table, making it 5-handed, and we're in the under the gun position with ace queen off. I open to 3 big blinds, and the cutoff folds. The button calls, who's the new player who sat down. The small blind folds, and the big blind calls. So this pot's gonna go one of 3 ways. The flop comes 4, jack, king, and we have a Broadway draw. This board is also pretty good for our range as the better, and so after the big blind checks it to me, I lead out again for 4.25 big blinds, which is a little under half. Button calls and big blind folds, so now we take it heads up. Now I know that the button's gonna be calling with a lot of weaker hands, but we're out of position, so we still gotta be careful. But I'm glad now we were able to isolate him. The turn comes the ace of spades, and now we have the best possible single pair, since we have top pair and the best kicker that doesn't give us 2 pair. Now I know this player has a tendency to want to call to see another card, so I try sizing up. I pick a sizing of 8.75 big blinds, about 60% of the pot. The button calls again like I was hoping, and I don't think we have to be too worried yet. River comes pretty safe because it's the 4 of hearts, but it does pair the board, and given our opponent's previous calls on both streets on the flop and turn, I opt to check here, and this may seem a little out of line at first, but given the fact that I have a really tight image and the board has come out with very high cards and he's called every single bet I've made, I think we can put him on a king or a jack here, possibly even a worse ace. And so I check to keep his bluffs in, and so I check to let him bluff on the river, but also because I was a little scared of the paired 4, because even though I said it was a safe card, I think the 4s made me get into my own head. He checks back though, and I table the winner. Upon analysis of this hand, I think betting the river is probably the better play, especially because I'm fairly confident to some degree that he has a middle pair. Now I know I'm not the best with women, But in this hand, we're looking to change that. I peel pocket queens from the small blind, and the under the gun limps. The cutoff folds, and the button raises to 2.5 bigs. We're in early position with a premium hand, and that means our hand plays better against less people. So in the small blind here, I'm going to be raising to 4 to 5x. I re-raised to 12.5 big blinds, hoping to go heads up. Under the gun is apprehensive on whether or not his hands are worth calling, but he calls anyway. The button calls too, so we take it 3 ways again. I'm playing against the 2 looser guys at the table, so I have to be aware of this as I go to a flop. The flop comes 5-4 deuce, so it's safe to say that pretty likely these 2 guys, even though they're loose, probably don't have anything on the board. Since I need to protect my hand because it's a very coordinated board, I need to lead out again. The under the gun checks at a turn, so we know he probably doesn't have anything of value, and so I make it 17.5 big blinds. This is almost a pot-sized bet, but it's because I don't like this board, and I'd like to play heads up. Under the gun calls, and fortunately the button folds, so I got my wish. The turn comes scary because it comes to 7 of spades. Even more draws are out there now, and even though it's unlikely that I'm beat here on the turn because you'd have to have exactly 6-3 or ace-3 or 8-6, I need to protect my hand against a potentially dangerous river card. I jam from my remaining stack, which is a little over the pot, but this is because it's unlikely that I'm beat here on the turn, but this turn card opened up a lot of draws, so we need to deny equity. We don't get snapped off, so that's a good sign. And after thinking for quite some time, under the gun decides to call. I ask how many times he wants to run it, to which he responds twice. Not sure if the river card's gonna screw us over, so I agree, and we're running 2 rivers. I table queens, and he says he'll wait till the board runs out. River 1 comes the ace of clubs, and river 2 comes the jack of hearts. He mucks his hand, and we take down a huge pot. The ladies did me well this time. 2 more players sit down at the table, so now it's 7-handed. Now that there are more people, we gotta start tightening up our range. We're on the hijack with 10-9 suited, and it folds around to us. Now typically you're not supposed to open with this, but we're in late position and we have a tight image, so we're gonna come in with the middle suited connector and see if we can cash in that image. I opened to 3 big blinds, and the cutoff folds. The button 3 bets to 10 big blinds, and the blinds fold out. If we call, he might have range advantage, but our hand is good enough to defend heads up, so I call. The flop comes 8 king 9 rainbow, giving us middle pair and a backdoor straight draw. I check to the button, who is the pre-flop raiser. He c-bets for about 30% of the pot, which is about 7.5 big blinds. Since we have a pair and quite a few cards that improve our hand, I call the peel 1. The turn comes a 3 and doesn't change any of our hands, so I check again. I fully expect our opponent to bet again, since he's probably aware that he has range advantage. As I expect, he fires again for 15 big blinds, and that's enough to get us to fold. Our opponent later told us that he double barrel bluffed, but because he's gonna be here with a king some of the time, it's probably not profitable for us to call. A few hands later, we're on the button, and we find a happy couple underneath our cards. King Queen suited is a great hand to play in position, so we shouldn't be afraid to 3-bet here. Under the gun straddles, and under the gun +1 limps in. The hijack folds, and the cutoff limps in as well. Now we're in position with a Broadway suited connector, so our hand's gonna play pretty well multi-way. With that in mind, a 3x raise would be fine. However, there are also 2 limpers and a straddle, so even though we're in position, we have to make a squeeze to punish the limpers. I choose a raise size of 12.5 big blinds. The small and big blind fold, and both the straddle and under the gun +1 call. The cutoff folds, so now we're going 3 ways to a flop. The flop comes King Jack 10 rainbow, and we flop an open-ended straight draw with top pair. Under the gun checks, and so does under the gun +1. It's our move, and I decide to bet about 2/3 of the pot, about 25 big blinds. After tanking for a while, under the gun finally decides to put in the call, but he was reluctant to, and this tells me that he either has a king with a weak kicker or a pair like jack or a 10. He would actually probably call without hesitation if he had a king, so I'm putting him on either a jack or a 10. Under the gun +1 gets out of the way and we take it heads up. Under the gun is already showing signs of weakness, so we have the green light to size up on the turn and put the pressure on him to fold. The turn comes to 7 of clubs, which doesn't change much at all. Our opponent checks, and since we didn't make our straight yet, we can size up to put our opponent to the test. I choose a bet size of 40 big blinds, which is about 2/3 of the pot. Our opponent looks unhappy now, and we're picking up tells that he wishes his hand were better. For that reason, even if he does call, on the river we can jam. Our opponent folds though, and we win the hand without even having to show our cards. After one person leaves and another person goes to the restroom, the table temporarily shrinks down to 5-handed. This means we can open up our range a little bit more and give ourselves more of an opportunity to win the pot. I've got King 9 of spades in the small blind, which means I shouldn't go too crazy, but I can get in there. Under the gun raises to 3.25 big blinds, and the cutoff calls. The button folds, so now action's on us. Now I know the player to the left of me in the big blind likes to call, so I know he's probably going to call or fold. Given that our hand plays well multi-way, under the gun +1 called, and the big blind is probably going to call too, we're getting a pretty good price to call as well. I called at 75 cents, and as I expected, the big blind also calls. It's 4 ways. The flop comes deuce, 4, ace, rainbow. We flop a backdoor, but that's about it. I check, big blind checks as well, and both the under the gun and cutoff check back. Everyone sees the free turn card. The turn comes a king and we get there. Now since the original pre-flop raiser didn't bet the flop, he probably doesn't have an ace. There are a couple of draws out there, so we need to protect our hand while we can. I bet $1.25, which is about half of the pot, which is 6.25 big blinds. The big blind folds, and under the gun calls. The cutoff folds too, and now it's heads up. The river comes the jack of hearts, which doesn't change much other than add the possibility of the Broadway straight. But he'd have to have exactly queen 10 for that. So I'm not too worried. I bet 13.75 big blinds for value. To my surprise, under the gun quickly raises me to $6, which is about 30 big blinds. Under the gun typically doesn't make too many bluffy raises like this, so now I know he definitely has something good. I also know that he plays pretty tight, so I know he's probably not playing off of the 4 or the 2. The hands that beat me that he could have here are probably King Jack or Queen 10. Since he checked the flop, he probably doesn't have an ace. He's not raising me with the worst king, and I don't think he'd even raise me with King Queen. His raise just doesn't make a whole lot of sense save for the 2 hands that I mentioned, King Jack and Queen 10. Something smells fishy and I want to look him up. I called to see what he's doing this with, and he actually turns over an ace. I was not expecting this at all, and this definitely deviates from the line he usually makes. I make a mental note and move on. A player comes back from the restroom, and we find ourselves in under the gun with King Jack off with 4 other people at the table. Normally, I wouldn't open with this hand under the gun, but a lot of these players at the table call and 3-bet light, so we'll be fine. The cutoff and button fold, as well as the small blind. The big blind calls, so it's heads up. The flop comes Jack 6-7 all spades. It's pretty scary since we don't hold a single spade, but our opponent checked his cards for spades, and then he announced no spades, and I actually believe him. He checks it over to us, and we continue for 3 big blinds. Now generally, a higher percentage of the time, we should be checking back on this flop, but this time I decided to bet. Our opponent calls, and we take it to a turn. The turn is the 8 of hearts, which puts 3 to a straight on the board, as well as increase the number of hands that are possible to have a straight or a straight draw. Our opponent bets 6.25, and since that's a good price for us, I call it off to see what he does on the river. The river is a little dicey as it comes to 2 of spades, making 4 to the flush. Any spade has a flush and we don't hold a single one. He bets 15 big blinds on the river, and now I'm in a weird position. He's trying to represent a spade, and it follows his story because he checked the flop, bet turn, and bet again on the river, which is probably what a flush would do. We're in a tough position with only a bluff catcher, and there are plenty of hands that he could have that make a straight or a flush here. However, based on my read that in the very beginning, he said, I have no spades, and he's never lied before, I have a feeling that he might be bluffing. I pitch in a calling chip to see what he has, and he shows ace jack with no spade, not even a straight. He notched me with the only hand that beats me and doesn't make a straight or a flush out of the hands he could hold here. I find it so strange that he bet both the turn and river with only top and 4 spades on the board. It's for super thin value, and betting this river with no spade while also having showdown value is pretty bad. Betting with ace jack on this river folds out hands that you beat and gets you calls from mostly hands that beat you. But it seems like my opponent either wasn't aware of this or he read my hand like a book. But at least we know our opponent is capable of getting out of line. In the future, I can capitalize on this. After this hand, I lose a double board PLO bomb pot after misplaying my hand and jamming all in when I shouldn't have. We're down a buy-in now, and we lost all of our winnings from the early hands in the session. But it's never too late to climb out of the hole, and we just gotta play right for the rest of the day. The night's nearing its end, and we gotta pick up our hands soon. I peel 10-9 off in the big blind, and under the gun and button limp. The small blind calls too, and now the action comes to me. Even though it's short-handed, 10-9 isn't a good hand to be raising here, especially early position, so I check my option. The flop comes Queen Jack 7 with 2 diamonds on the board. We're open-ended, and we have a backdoor flush draw. Small blind checks to me, and I think in this position, either checking or betting is okay. Checking disguises the strength of our hand, and allows us to possibly peel a free turn card. Betting, however, allows us to get to the turn and river with a chance of folding out some people in the hand. It also would allow us to build the pot. In this scenario, I choose to bet, and I place 2.5 big blinds on the table. Under the gun, button, and small blind call, so no one leaves the hand yet. It's still 4 ways to a turn. The turn comes the king of spades, and now we have the second nuts. The likelihood that someone has an ace, however, is low because everyone limped into the pot, which means the average strength of everyone's hands is pretty low. The small blind checks to me again, and now since there are 2 spades and 2 diamonds, I gotta size up to protect my hand. I bet 150, which is over the pot. Under the gun calls, and the button raises to 20 big blinds. The small blind folds, and I re-raise to $8, which is 40 big blinds. The reason why I min-clicked it and didn't raise higher is because if I raised higher and my opponent called, I'd be forced to go all in on the river no matter what. Raising this way leaves me enough chips to have some fold equity if I get a bad card on the river. Furthermore, raising makes it scary for any flush draw to try to want to call this turn. And so this way I'm protecting my straight. The button calls, and now it's heads up. The pot is huge, so if we can win this, we can pretty much climb out of our hole. Unfortunately, however, the river card comes a 6 of spades, and now the backdoor spades is complete. However, it is the back door, and there's a good chance that a lot of these spade draws would have folded the flop. My opponent doesn't look too happy about the river, and so I feel like he's giving me the okay to jam here. I jam for my remaining stack, which is about a half pot bet, and he snaps me off. At first I'm pretty scared, but he shows the same hand as me, and we chop. I'm getting kind of frustrated because now when I'm picking up hands, I'm either getting notched or I have to chop. We have to stay disciplined though, and we can't let our emotions get to us. In the last hand of the night, we're in the big blind with king jack off again. Under the gun folds, and the button limps. The small blind opens to $2 or 10 big blinds, which is a huge raise. Our hand is good enough to defend, however, so we grab some calling chips and we go heads up. It's the same guy that we played that we lost king jack with, and we're out for revenge. The flop comes 10-9 jack, and we make top pair with the gut shot. Our opponent down bets to $1.80, which is 9 big blinds. I see no reason to raise or fold, so we just flat. The turn comes a 7 of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on the board and making it to where any 8 has a straight. Our opponent bets $5, which is about 85 to 90% of the pot, about 25 big blinds. Now before we click the fold button, we have to be aware of his raise size preflop and his betting behavior. He raised big preflop, which probably means that he either has a really strong hand that he's trying to charge value for, or a really marginal hand that he really only wants to play heads up. The latter is more likely true. Now we remember from previous hands that our opponent can overplay a lot of these spots even when the board comes dangerous, and so for that reason I call. The river comes the 8 of diamonds, putting a straight on the board and completing the flush. The only way we lose if he has a queen or if he has 2 diamonds in his hand. He checks to us and we make one of the biggest mistakes of the night. Knowing that if he checks, he probably doesn't have 2 diamonds and he probably doesn't have a queen. So more often than not, it's going to be a chop for us. But since we're in position, we have the option to jam on him. I made the mistake of checking back here, but if I jammed, it's entirely possible that he could have folded and we would have won a huge pot. Because he checked the river, he's essentially forfeiting his hand, and if we jam, the worst that happens to us is he calls and we chop, whereas the best case is we steal the pot. Unfortunately, I miss out on this opportunity and I don't get to take my revenge, but I learned my lesson here. That's it for this session, and we're down about $35, and we did twice our normal buy-in for $20 instead of $10. It's not too terrible, and we've kind of been on a hot streak, so we had to come down eventually, but I learned a lot this session. And I think I have a bit of information on a couple people at the table that I'll be able to employ the next time we play. I know this video was kind of long, but I played quite a few hands today since we played 4-handed. And I spent a lot of time working on these videos as well as the voiceovers. So I really hope you enjoyed. Hopefully we'll be able to lock up a win next session. I'll see you next week.